Welcome everybody to the second session of this year's Collegiate Recovery Summer Series. This session, we're going to talk about what it means to set us up for success. So we can asset map, strategize, make sure we're building things that are sustainable, informed by what we know, and also be learning something along the way. So the topics for today are, of course, what is asset mapping? It's a term I learned for the first time from our guest today, probably 5 years ago, I think, 2017-ish. We're going to talk about the process of finding your strengths and the resources on campus and in your community. We're going to put that knowledge to work in that process, and then talk about some additional avenues in case you want to kind of pursue some different ways of strategizing. And then we're going to have a cool conversation, Q&A with Kristin Harper, who we'll introduce here in a bit, and myself. And so as always, every single thing we do, ask questions, put them in the Q&A if you want, but if you want to just throw in the chat as we're going, keep on going. So yeah. I always like to start this session with this slide that is a quote that I think many of us have heard many times, whether we are on campus or working in the community or both. Do more with less, especially as a lot of us are hopefully beginning to exit the pandemic financial cuts or sacrifices that we had to make, and we're entering the new fiscal year. Hopefully you're seeing budgets go back up, or things kind of return a little bit back to normal financially and responsibility wise for your team. And every year we still see kind of the cinching of the belt of do more with less. What this, if you've heard this before, let me know in the chat. Because what this often looks like is, okay, your budget's the same or your budget is less. We want you to do more. We want you to have more of a student impact, to continue to prove that you're worth even keeping around. It includes recovery that often leaves us almost on an island where we're not quite sure what we can do. We know what we want to do, and we have to kind of meet things in the middle a little bit. So that's what we're really going to be focusing on today, is how do we do this in an informed way, especially in a way that spreads the love a little bit, where we can figure out who our partners are, the assets we have, and make sure we're not doing this work alone, because when we do it alone, that's the easiest way for us to burn out, for our students to also feel like they're alone, and for our campus to not fully be able to take advantage of what collegiate recovery is and what it has to offer. So to introduce the term of the day, asset mapping, I'm going to read this definition for you. Asset mapping is the general process of identifying and providing information about a community's assets, or the status, condition, behavior, knowledge, or skills that a person, group, or entity possesses, which serves as a support, resource, or source of strength to oneself and others in the community. What that really means is we're just going to go about figuring out the things that we have on our campus and our community that can be helpful to our goals. We'll talk a bit about what this process looks like, but at the very least, asset mapping is that process of what do we have, maybe what are some gaps, and then what do we have to work with. Something I want to reframe a bit that was important to me as I started asset mapping is this idea that collegiate recovery is often founded out of an understanding that universities are recovery hostile, meaning, and this is, of course, that there is reality in this, that the social culture of universities glorifies substance use and often feels alienating for students who are in recovery or even sober curious. Kind of the full range of questioning and being thoughtful and reflective about substance use is not as celebrated or as welcomed as it should be. And that's an understatement. But what asset mapping for me forced me to do was understand that the university can often be, and the time of being at a university can often be the most resourced part of anyone's lifespan. It is not common for someone to be able to kind of just walk across the street or walk across campus and access counseling that they may have already paid for. Their insurance is already ready to cover. And so that is just one example of just the amount of resources and the amount of things that a college campus has to offer these students, that when we help them collaborate in a recovery supportive manner, we may be creating one of the best environments a student in recovery may ever also find. And so that can then help them learn how to navigate and know what they need before they then leave campus and have to do a little bit more work to find the resources that they may be learning about in college. I know some of our students may access counseling or even physical health services for the first time while in college, or maybe asking questions about their wellness they didn't even know how to ask before becoming a student. So I'm hoping today that we can kind of begin the conversation around building that foundation so that collegiate recovery can be sustainable, and also create lifelong support for our students. Another kind of question that some folks will often have during this conversation is, why are we talking about asset mapping if I'm already ahead of you doing strategic planning? It's the summer, maybe you've already put in your strategic plan a month or so ago, but especially as we go through this year and we're trying to implement some recovery supportive services, how do we do the research throughout the year and do the learning and the gathering throughout this academic year to build a more successful and more approachable strategic plan, so that we're a little bit more targeted. So we'll talk a bit more towards the end of this session about the impact of asset mapping and these processes on the strategic planning process. And then we'll give you some strategic planning resources in the email that you'll get tomorrow or the day after. But today we're going to focus on kind of building or kind of playing in the soil, playing in the sand of what is available so that strategic plans can be more successful. All right. Again, if you have questions as I go, if you want me to repeat something, feel free to throw it in the Q&A or the chat. Why do we asset map? Some reasons that we asset map are we want to start something new. Many of you are there. The group that we're working with on these Tuesdays are folks who are relatively new to this work. So you may be starting something new. You're also seeking to not replicate what already exists. I think collegiate recovery initiatives can often get in the habit of recreating what already exists, but in a recovery supportive way. And if we can do that when necessary, but also just help the university transform as it needs to through education, through awareness, through skills, so that we don't have to just shoulder all of the weight of the needs of these students, because it can be hefty. We asset map because we want to include those who would benefit in the creation of a resource. Again, we don't want to start kind of on our own little island and then get stuck there. We want to develop partnerships through the exploration of assets, skills, and contributions. What even exists? How do we work together to elevate what already does exist? And then again, what resources are people already using? What are our students already involved in? How do we, again, not misuse resources by reproducing things that don't need to be reproduced just yet? The steps to asset mapping simply are first to just recognize what exists. So researching and listing out the resources and assets that are available to your cause and stakeholders. So again, what exists for your students and the people involved by or impacted by addiction on your campus. Then kind of mapping those things out, organizing what you found in ways that suit your project. And so we'll talk about what that can look like here in a minute. But really you're talking, some people will do it physically with a map, some people will do concepts, the mind map, and some will just do it thematically. In the third step, which we'll talk about later in the summer series, is mobilizing. How do we utilize the partnerships we've built, the stakeholders we know, and the members of our movement to connect with the assets we've recognized and mapped to then garner buy-in, so that we've created this network and this foundation that even when things get a little bit shaky, we're not going anywhere. Often we kind of skip over this and we go straight into starting our program. And while that can be, you can get lucky sometimes, I think asset mapping is a really great way to, again, garner sustainability as students graduate, as staff move on, things like that. And then again, those of you who did the homework for this week, you've already done a lot of step one. And so we've gotten a bit of a head start through doing the census and through kind of asking yourself some of the questions of what exists on our campus, what doesn't exist, that you can use today to think about what have you still to recognize a bit of, how do you move into mapping, and then again, in our last webinar session, we'll talk about mobilizing and being an advocate for this work. All right, so recognizing. You'll get a link tomorrow of a couple of resources for this. But when it comes to learning what is available, here's a couple options to start with. First one is ask your students. Our students know what works for them, know what they're using, know what resources have been available to them or made not available to them. A lot of universities will choose to hold focus groups. They'll find 5 or 10 students, ask them questions, and see what comes out of it. Let your students tell you what already exists, because especially if you're a newer professional on campus, you'll often find a lot through students that you wouldn't have found otherwise. You can also just move your way around move your eyes around the university's org chart and also the website. Take notes, look at who's doing what connections are where, what offices are relatively close to each other. Maybe they're supervised by the same person. Understanding, the lay of the land and the way that your university is built out of human beings can be really helpful in helping you recognize who does what and where you can start, and maybe where you can take some shortcuts to understanding and building partnerships. Just Googling is a really great way to figure out what exists. Looking at recovery resources in your city, your state. As I mentioned in one of these bubbles, the Recovery Resource Hub is a resource that is a national map of what exists around the country. That map has been slowly kind of sunsetting a bit over the past few years, but it's still a good place to start, I think. You'll get that link again in the email with the resources. But at the very least, knowing what exists in your community, maybe even what exists right across the street from your campus, can be really helpful. As an example, a lot of campuses will start maybe a 12-step meeting on campus and then learn a month later that there's already one across the street from campus. And maybe they can start creating something a bit more unique that doesn't require a repetition of resources, or they can make their meeting more student focused so it isn't a repetition of what already exists. And then you can always just solicit information through on-campus marketing, cold calls, emails, things like that. Just kind of dig into your university and think about what is available. And I always encourage folks in this moment to, again, not just ask the most pointed questions of what recovery resources look like on campus, because that can often, I think, pigeonhole us into the traditional understandings of recovery, where if we zoom back out a bit and use that definition of recovery we talked about last week of what resources support student health, that's a part of recovery. What resources are involved in the housing process and finding housing on and off campus for our students? How do students find purpose on campus? What about allies on campus that may already exist? And really dig into the many facets of wellness and recovery that our students could benefit from. And you may be surprised on who you find is already on your team, or maybe has already been doing this work and has yet to meet you yet. So again, dig in and be creative, but also be very open-minded in this process. So I'm going to stop talking for a bit and get a drink of water, but I'm going to encourage you all to engage in the chat for a minute. What types of assets immediately come to mind for you? What are the things on campus that you think are recovery supportive, or the folks that you want to go meet to figure out the recovery support that they may already offer? What kinds of things are your students using for support? So a list of places to start, So young people's AA meetings around campus, especially if it's good to just know where meetings and things like that are around campus, especially like treatment, 12-step or other types of recovery meetings. Just having non-substance involved events is important. And then this slide has a lot of places just to start, right? And so one thing that I always like to do is to look up all the coursework on campus. Kind of go into the course catalog, maybe do a control F, look for classes that have the words drugs or substances, or look through the social work curriculum or the counseling curriculum on your campus, or kind of the various majors that would feel related to recovery. And see who their faculty members are, reach out to them, build a list, and kind of make your way down, just emailing and calling them and saying, hey, do you have any interest in a resource that I'm building, or what do you know already exists? What student mentors, wellness services, community members, spiritual leaders. You may have some folks on your campus that are trained for certain types of recovery meetings, like SMART meetings, treatment providers in the local area, basic needs resources like a food pantry. is a great place to start. Yeah, especially if you have students who are saying, for example, this counselor or this academic counselor or this person student conduct was really receptive when I needed help. Those are folks to keep in your back pocket and make a list of. And of course, alumni, if you are able to get involved in the alumni circles, it can be tricky. But yeah, sometimes alumni went through the campus years ago and wish they had something that was recovery supportive, or wish they had a collegiate recovery program to be supportive of them, but now they want to pay forward or pay back what they didn't get. And so they want to be supportive of what you're doing. You're going to get in the email tomorrow, again, with the resources, the list that I think Kristin actually helped build of the collegiate recovery assets. And so the assets that if a campus has them, they can be really helpful in building a collegiate recovery initiative. There are 9 of them, I believe. Yeah. And so the census that you all likely have taken by now was built using keeping those assets in mind. And so you've seen them, you're familiar with them, but you'll get a resource tomorrow that puts them kind of very clear and very obvious as a place to start. So the next step is mapping. 1 second. So the next step is mapping, which is just, again, taking all of this stuff, this kind of pile of information you just gathered, list of names, lists of emails, lists of stuff, ideas, again, just throw it all out there in the recognition section. And then now we have to kind of sort through it. So again, like I said before, it's important to do this in a way that just makes sense for what you're doing. And so some folks want to do a spreadsheet. I'm not a spreadsheet brained type person, but some people, yeah, want to list it all out, kind of get it all organized in that way. And then the thematic, some people want to do a theme. They want to get a whiteboard and they want to just put things in themes and maybe delegate certain themes to certain people to then go reach out or set up bigger meetings so that the things that are themed closer together can have similar conversations. Some folks will put a map on a wall and start pinning things out. Maybe it's a map of the campus. You just want to figure out, hey, if we were going to have a collegiate recovery program, for example, what side of campus would it make sense to have it on, or should it just be in the center of campus? Things like that. And again, some folks will just write a long formal report, type it all out, type out the strategy, type out the thoughts. Again, there's no right or wrong answer here. There are pros and cons of each, but whatever you choose, just make sure it's something that you can maintain and update. And so while I'm definitely a scribble over the whiteboard type person, I then have to take a picture of it, upload it to my computer, make it into like a PowerPoint slide or two, and then come back to it periodically. So this is a bit more free form, a bit more of just whatever you would like to do to map, but it's important just to make sense of everything, because when we get stuck in the recognition step of this, it's easy to kind of never come out of that step and constantly be toiling and trying to just learn and learn and learn. And it makes it very hard to mobilize resources because we haven't organized them yet. So with more mobilizing, like I said before, we're going to talk about that in week 5. We're talking about what it means to make your case for collegiate recovery, more recovery supports on your campus. What data do we have? What can you use? What resources can SAFE offer you? Then some of you may be making kind of the connections already between other ways to learn more about what exists and what you can do. One is a community assessment, where you just want to learn more about the relationships between the community and its services. There's resource mapping and assessment. So how are resources being coordinated, utilized, and managed? There's environmental scans, where you can figure out what factors surrounding our initiative may impact our abilities to succeed. And then gap analysis, which is just what is missing and why is it missing. These all have their own kind of approaches and ways of doing. We're not going to dig into those today because today's about asset mapping, but with a Google or with a search, I'm sure you can find kind of ways to jump into these. These seem like the questions, the kind of research ideas that you're more comfortable with or feel more accessible to you based on what you know or your approach to this work. But the final question kind of becomes, how do we leverage this awareness that we've learned through asset mapping into a more effective strategic plan? So for me, when we asset map on our way to strategic planning, we're able to answer a few questions that can be barriers to strategic planning, especially if you're new to the university. And so you can better figure out what your entry points are, what your path of least resistance may be. How can you not reproduce efforts? Who is on your team? And then we have this really cool balance where we can both meet the campus where it's at and also vision where it wants to be. And so we can be a catalyst for that change rather than kind of just throwing ideas at the wall and trying to get people to care, which is a pitfall that we all kind of can fall in sometimes, as some campuses don't even understand what this work means or how it even starts. And so, like I said, we can balance this idea of, we definitely want to have some risky goals, some aspirations that we want to have of, we want to have 50 students next year with a house and housing and a budget of X, Y, and Z. But we also need to kind of, as we're getting started, have those goals that we know we can meet so that we can prove that we're being effective. Because if we only have the aspirational or the dreams and we don't get them, it's hard to advocate for budgets next year. Or if we can say, look, we said we were going to work with 10 students and we did, those students have gotten this impact out of it, and the next steps should be X, Y, and Z. So basically the saying, you shoot for the moon, you land among the stars. It's not actually how a lot of the physics work in that saying, but we all heard that saying before. So any questions before we move on to the Q&A part? Yeah, if you have not done the census yet, that was homework for this week, do it for next week, and then it'll help you a lot with the homework we'll talk about here in a few minutes. All right, well, we're gonna bring Kristin up. Kristin, hello.
Hey, Dylan.
So yeah, we're talking with Kristin today. As I mentioned before, I heard the phrase asset mapping from Kristin, and I think it was 2017, and I was initially so confused. I had no idea what I was doing. And Kristin, of course, helped us figure it out. So it's a bit weird to have been presenting while Kristin's in the audience, but instead of me doing a long, drawn-out introduction about all the work we've done together over the past couple of years and put all the praise upon you that you deserve, would you like to first introduce yourself to the folks who maybe don't know you or don't know the work that you've done?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Dylan. And I think you did a phenomenal job. I was a proud mama over here. So you paid attention. So hi, everybody that I don't know. My name is Kristin Harper, and I've been involved with Collegiate Recovery since 2008. I started a program in South Georgia at Georgia Southern University way back when. And then I worked at Texas Tech in the replication program for a couple of years. And so I've been doing collegiate recovery since there were about 11 schools nationally. So I'm like feeling really old right now. But I've learned a lot of mistakes, and I like to share my mistakes as much as possible. So hopefully those of you that are out there just getting started from the ground up, I saw in the chat, won't have to repeat them. We've also refined a lot of the process, I think, in program implementation for collegiate recovery that I'd love to chat about today. Currently, I work for a national nonprofit called Faces and Voices of Recovery. I'm the director of recovery innovation. And so that means that I like to take research, emerging research, best practices, and get kind of messy on a whiteboard too, and figure out, what's going to be next for the recovery community. So if y'all have stumbled upon new ways to do things, please share them. I'd love to find out what you're working on and get excited together about it.
Yeah, and I introduced to them last week, kind of, because again, you were helping, and we're at Transforming Youth Recovery for a few years. And so we introduced the statistics and the censusing that you all did in 2016, 17. And we ended that conversation by saying, and the future of collegiate recovery is up to you all. It's up to you and it's up to your students, because we've been trying a lot of different things over the years. And I think we're now at a place where this is ready to blow up in a really cool way that will require us to be really creative and really innovative at every step, while also saying, these are the foundations we don't need to make up and reinvent the wheel every time. And so asset mapping being one of those things where I think we can lean on. The process is it's not linear, but it's repeatable kind of over and over again.
And it really is. I think that asset mapping is just a fancy way of saying relationship building at the end of the day. I mean, that really is all that it is. It's figuring out, if I move to a new neighborhood or a new town or new state, as soon as I get there, I'm going to look for things that I need, right? Like grocery stores and pharmacies and a place to buy really fun shoes, like things like that I need to make my life happy. And it's the same thing when you're starting a program, is looking around on campus and trying to build the relationships with people, and not only looking for opportunities of how they can help me, but also how I can present what we're doing as an opportunity to them. And I think that was a big learning curve initially, coming in with lived experience as a person in recovery, being on fire for recovery, trying to kind of force recovery advocacy on different departments. And when I took a step back and started doing the asset mapping, realizing, oh, so this is their goal there within this department, or this person is looking for this type of solution. And so trying to figure out how we could also present opportunities to those that we were trying to build relationships with.
Yeah, I learned about asset mapping. I was in grad school still. And then what it helped me do as a professional was not come into a new environment and pretend like I had the answers.
Right.
And we all see folks come into new environments and be pressured into taking action immediately. And then having that like first 3 months of being on fire, and then the cliff comes. And it's like, well, you've either burnt so many bridges or made so many people feel like you don't appreciate their work, that now your job is not just creating relationships, it's also repairing relationships.
Yeah.
And that's a really not fun situation to be in. But that segues to our first question, which is, as a professional and in the different roles you've had, what has been that role of asset mapping in your work?
Yeah, I think it's been, over the years, I have learned to get as much intel as possible, right? To be able to be strategic on moving forward with our plans, and both from a local collegiate recovery standpoint, also ran a recovery community organization, which is a nonprofit standalone in the community. Really understanding what the community has to provide to our stakeholders, but then also understanding who our stakeholders are, right? And so even before the asset mapping process starts, is really understanding, who are we trying to serve? And yes, it is students, but we also have a couple of other buckets. And so understanding that we are not only trying to provide services and programming for students that may be already in recovery, take it a next step further and say, well, maybe the campus is also looking for some additional supports for students who are, sober curious, or maybe there's some departments on campus that would like to learn more about recovery, and just being very, really, really strategic about how do I organize those assets. And then also, if you have a board, or if you have fundraising on the horizon that you're going to be needing to do, then also understanding that some other of your buckets to classify are going to be, where can you draw funding from? And where can you maybe potentially get some event sponsors? Maybe there's some other categories that you're looking at. Maybe you want to start a recovery mentorship program for your students. And so then classifying some of those assets. So really the role of asset mapping is kind of the first thing that I do whenever I start a new job, or doing any kind of program implementation, or if I'm contracting with those that are wanting to do some program implementation or community asset mapping. We always look at, well, who are we wanting to serve? What's our target audience? And then we can kind of go out from there.
Can you talk a bit about, because I think there's a kind of a feedback loop between like mission and vision of what are we looking to do here, and then but also needing to be a little bit nimble as you learn what there is. And so if you're coming in and saying, like, I use the example a lot of folks come to us like, we want to start a collegiate recovery program tomorrow.
Yeah.
And then they start talking to people, and folks are just like so stigmatizing, so against did these students even exist, that they go, oh wait, maybe we want to start maybe a mentorship program to get peers more involved. We kind of want to reimagine what our goal was initially. So part of this program for the summer, for the summer series, is we're going to do a bit of a first draft of a goal, but then we're going to end with kind of more final draft a couple of weeks later. Yeah, how do you balance, to kind of shorten my question, how do you balance asset mapping with mission and vision?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so by training, I've been taught to think about what's the end result, where do we want to get to, right? And so at the end of the day, when I was starting a collegiate recovery program, we wanted to have recovery support services that would support collegiate recovery students. And then working back from that, we had to figure out, okay, so what is it going to take to break down barriers for us to be able to do that? And some of those barriers were financial. Some of those barriers were environmental. You touch on stigma. That was a huge one. I think we'll probably always be kind of fighting that one through educational programs. And so moving backwards, at the end of the day, we would like to have a healthy, robust program. Maybe your mission is to also have actual brick and mortar on campus, a center. So not just a program, but a center. Figuring out what are the barriers to get there. Maybe student recruitment is another barrier. And just working backwards from there and understanding that you're going to have to make adjustments with your initial plan. Is a working document. And it's going to be really dependent on some of the resources that are available to you, but then also some of the information that you uncover. For example, so when I was at Georgia Southern, we wanted to increase our student recruitment, right? So we had like 3 students when we first started off in 2008 that were interested in helping to start the Collegiate Recovery Program. And I was like, this is awesome. I was told if we build it, they will come. And so we've got 3, so just more are going to show up. And that actually was not the case at all. And so we had to pivot and start thinking about, what are some student incentives? And because we had done some resource mapping or asset mapping, we understood that a relationship with the disability office was really important for us because our target audience, our recovery students that were already on campus, wanted priority registration, and that particular office ran priority registration. And so I think I had like a whole list of other to-dos prior to something like that, but I had to pivot and make that a new priority, because if we didn't have students, you don't have a community, and then you can't build a program around that.
Yeah, and that's a beautiful segue into the second question, which is, what are some of those resources that you would encourage folks to maybe like reach out to first, or things that they should focus on when they begin the asset mapping process so that we have a good start to this?
Yeah, so really building collegiate recovery programs boils down to identifying students and getting them engaged, and getting some kind of support from your institution. Obviously, it would be like ideal Mercedes option would be that the president says, we're going to do this, and here's your budget. It's in my particular budget. Kennesaw State kind of started off like that. But even then, you want to make sure that you understand other stakeholders and what they need. So before you really get started, if you're in this position, I suggest trying to identify people in recovery that are either students currently or want to be students, and sit down with them and do some focus groups, or even listening sessions, and just ask them, what would you like? What are you interested in? And just find out, particularly for that population, what's really important. And then you should do like the one-off conversations with some key department directors or coordinators, and find out, how could we be helpful to what you're doing on campus too? And so just understanding the landscape, both from inside the recovery community and then also your campus community, and starting from there, and then kind of branching out from that information.
Yeah. Do you have any advice about when it makes sense to start looking into like grants and like things like that? Because I know there never seems to be a right time, because the right time seems to be all the time. Yeah. But any advice on that?
Yeah, so grants are tricky. The reason why they're tricky, depending on your university and the way the development office works, you also probably want to meet with your development officer. And the department that you're housed in, there may already be this huge moving machine around development work and grants. And so you need to understand a little bit more about what's happening with that. I would say shoot for small grants to start off with. I think, looking at, we have Kroger here, which is a grocery store chain, looking at things like that. I know that we were able to secure quite a bit of funding from one of the grocery store chains out in West Texas, for example. When I was out there, just, looking at locally, is it a large car dealership? Is it, agriculture? It's just kind of what's your thing in your local area, and see if they have grants available from like corporate sponsorship to, maybe 4-H is looking at expanding or something, just think outside of the box. But looking at the larger federal grants or state grants is going to be a really, really heavy lift. Even our organization has been around for 20 years. We have, 18 staff. Same with Safe Project. You guys are newer, but you have like a robust infrastructure. even for us to submit a federal or state grant, it's ridiculously challenging, especially if you don't have any kind of data to report. So the other thing I usually tell folks to is start collecting data immediately, whether it's just demographics or the number of students that you're engaging with on a daily basis. Go ahead and start collecting that as soon as you can, and just keep an eye out for those smaller grant or funding opportunities.
Yeah, and on top of kind of the quantitative data, I would always I had like a Word document I would just keep going all the time in my office that students would never see. After we had a meeting or after we had a cool event, I would keep my ears open for like, oh, what are the things they're talking about? I could ask them how it went, what was their feedback, and I would just take notes. And so when we had that random crowdfunding campaign, I had quotes for flyers and for the video that didn't require students to be part of an evaluation all the time, because sometimes it can be a balance of how do you make these students understand that evaluation is an important part of sustainability. And so them being willing to take that survey once a month or whatever is them paying back to the program and being of service, but also not make them feel like they are a lab rat who has to be constantly giving their blood for this program. So
absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, that's even if you have students engaged, right? So if you're like super, super new, or maybe you're coming back and the program was dormant for a while, you don't have students yet. Another asset that I tell people to look out for is potential either advisory board, or if you're allowed to call it a board with your university, maybe it's just a council or something that you want to create. The asset mapping can also be done by them. And then also, if you do have graduate students or students that just really want to get involved, they can also help with asset mapping as well. And so then you're getting different perceptions on what assets are considered depending on who the stakeholder is that's doing the asset mapping.
Yeah. Another segue. Tips and tricks that you have for folks, because you said asset mapping is partnership development for the most part, relationship building. What may be some pitfalls you found in terms of people doing that, maybe not so well, but really, what are the tips and tricks you found in making that a smoother process, especially on campuses that have no history of collegiate recovery, maybe don't even know these students exist at this point?
Yeah, so the Georgia Southern experience was really great for me. It was a baptism by fire for sure. The dean that I reported to, because we were housed in the College of Public Health, the first thing he told me to do was get out and hit the pavement when I first got there. It was just me, only staff, had an office and a computer, and that was it. That's what we started with. And he's like, all right, so get out and start meeting people. And so I did. I was super friendly. I took chocolate covered strawberries to different offices. Like I was just like, just get out there and make friends. And one of the things I really wish that I had done was created some kind of way to organize the conversations that I was having with people. And so even coming back and like jotting down notes on, this is what was said, putting it in a spreadsheet or whiteboard, wherever makes sense to you. I think there's, different client management software now like Salesforce and stuff, which not a huge fan of, but it does help if you have that. But just organizing the conversation so they aren't lost, and then doing follow-up. So that's the other thing too. I used to tell people that I was providing technical assistance to just to go online and take a look and see what's available to you near your location, and just start recording all of that, which is great. That's the first step though, right? Because if you're building relationships, these people that you've put on your spreadsheet don't know that you've targeted them for a potential asset. So you want to make sure that you create some kind of timeline where you reach out to people. And the last thing is you want to make sure that they understand why you're contacting them and what your goal is. And so having either some kind of follow-up ask, doesn't have to be huge. It could just be like, hey, what if we set up like a check-in call for another month? Or if you're having an event, send them an invitation, or even something as simple as adding them to a listserv and you're doing like a monthly newsletter, just making sure that everybody that you're talking to and that you're touching base with remains engaged with you. So it's not just like a one-time meeting and then you disappear.
Yeah, I relate to that a lot, because I think when I was at University of Denver, I was lucky that my mentor on campus was a very extroverted, very well-connected human being. They basically dragged me around from event to event. Like, you need to meet people, like, please meet people. And I was able, because I worked in housing beforehand, so I was able to really connect with the housing folks, and then met the what that really reminded me of is how much work partnerships take and how much work those relationships actually require. And so I knew that I would be doing a disservice to the housing folks, for example, if I was also trying to pursue 50 other partnerships.
Yeah.
I could say, okay, this is a good place to start. I can really kind of sow some seeds here without I can really get something out of this. Or if we get kind of stuck too long just trying to meet as many people as possible,
Yeah.
kind of get into that woo cycle of, oh crap, now I'm just having 10-second meetings with 100 people. I
Yeah.
can't remember any of your names.
Yeah.
And for me, it was always important to develop partnerships that I knew were with people who also had vulnerable relationships with students. And so, yeah, housing, conduct, case management, folks that if they knew I existed and we had a relationship, I would come to mind for them when they were having that hard conversation with a student.
Yeah.
And they would know when a boundary had been crossed where they said, shoot, I'm not the person for you right now, but maybe Dylan is, or maybe the students in the CRC might be the people for you. So yeah, it's like being really intentional there, but also not spreading yourself too thin.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I think that what's tricky for collegiate recovery directors and coordinators is this balance between understanding campus and then also understanding the local community, because there's been so many university people that I've worked with where they say we can't find recovery people on campus, but there's a robust recovery community off campus. And we know that there's students that are on campus, but depending on where you are and your university standards for admissions, a lot of after the first year of being established may come from recruitment of off campus. Right. So if you can be that liaison or that bridge between off campus assets like recovery houses or treatment facilities, or maybe there's like a credit recovery program for high school students, or, community colleges, huge asset for any four-year university. Being that bridge for people that want to apply, you could help them through the application process. It's just another asset that you bring to the community. It's a niche that not many people on campus can fill. And so it's really nice to be that resource for off campus too.
Yeah, I think it's okay. Some people in the audience today are going to be like, yes, that is who I am. I think Kenneth I've spoken to before in West Virginia, he had said that like his work is to connect and almost like translate across those boundaries so that students can access things they wouldn't otherwise. Or some people are just like fundraising machines, and they're like their skill are with folks who have more resources, and maybe they're not the best with a student who's in mid relapse or kind of actively struggling. And it's okay to own that and have those boundaries with yourself and know, okay, where's my like wheelhouse and where is it not? At the very least, then you can deliver that to a partnership and know what you're delivering and not overpromise, or at the very least you can underpromise and overdeliver. I think it's that was always helpful for me was the underpromise overdeliver move, so that I could have room to struggle if I needed to. And then one thing I want to mention is, because partnerships are so heavy and can be so much work, you'll often, if you keep your eyes open around campus and your ears open, you might find where the university has already kind of like hijacked the partnership system, especially around like student emergencies. And so I've been on a couple of campuses now where when you get hired during your orientation, they give you the red folder. The red folder is covered front to back, inside and out, with all of the emergency resources, all the things you need to know as a staff member who works with students. It's not on every campus, but there can sometimes be that website or that portal that you go to that has those all in one spot. We made a big push to get ourselves in that folder, or to make our own version of the red folder that was a purple folder for students in recovery, or things like that you can kind of reproduce what already exists, but in the way it needs to be done for what you're doing. So yeah, just kind of the creativity there is really important, and also make that convenient, where again, we had a purple folder. Inside that purple folder were flyers, reference cards, information on treatment centers, things that if a student came in and said, I need help, they could pull that folder out of from the bottom of the stack of stuff on their desk, because they'd never seen it in 8 months, but they knew that's what it was. And so
and Dylan, you're sharing that story, and the way you started off was just understanding like where your lane is and what your own personal assets are, right? And so when you're doing asset mapping, it's not just about what's on the external part of the program. It's also looking at what do you actually have access to internally. And starting from there. And so if it's just you, if there's one staff, what's your experience? What are your strengths? How can you connect best with some of these people that you're building relationships with? If you have multiple staff, then you have many different skills to draw from, right? But oftentimes, unfortunately, we find that collegiate recovery is managed by one person who's probably doing 4 different jobs.
Right.
So I think some of those particular collegiate recovery coordinators or directors that I'm thinking about, they got really creative with what could fit in with what they're already doing for a campus. And then building it out from there. And I think that that's really the place to start with asset mapping, is taking a look at your own desk, like what do you have on your books right now that you're working on, and then working out from there.
Yeah, where I see folks often really stumble in that is when they get that first ask for, well, what are you even doing?
Yeah.
Prove to me that you're doing something important. And we often go, oh, shoot, like probably cussing a little bit more than me watering that down right now. But like, we begin to kind of act for the university and kind of like, oh, we were hired, so I don't have to act in the way that you want me to. There's definitely a middle ground that it's intimidating, but it's important to kind of walk that line sometimes of, I understand the values and the assets of this university. I understand who I am, what I offer. I'm not going to make up data to make you think I'm doing something I'm not.
Right.
But I believe in what I'm doing enough to tell you what I am doing because I have been productive.
Yeah.
And so, yes, that process, but also understanding the asset mapping can create. It can also keep you from burning out.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it really, when you're doing that internal kind of evaluation or inventory, it's take a look at your university's strategic plan, the mission, anything that's sort of like a hot, trendy topic for the university, and lead with that for certain departments and certain contacts that you're, again, providing an opportunity to be of service to the university related to blah, blah, blah of the strategic plan.
Yep. It was, I remember I did my first presentation to like leadership at the last university I was at. I literally took phrases from the like goals for 2025 plan. Those were the headlines of the slides I used because, again, it's about making, yes, the university accessible to these students, but also making this work accessible to people who could serve these students.
Right.
That alone is an asset. Just understanding is an asset. Not just your understanding, but everyone else around you, so they can serve these students. And so, yeah, use the language sometimes against them if you need to be an advocate and like twist some arms. Hey, you say you value social justice, but clearly you don't care about these students. That can be a moment of like, oh crap. And so, yeah, like just know the kind of the place you're at.
Right.
With that, what are some surprises you've seen? I use the example all the time of there was a tutoring program at the university I was at, that each student who had a tutor, the tutor was also their mentor. And so that mentorship relationship was very tight, but it was also a lot of students whose parents said, my student is struggling, not quite sure why. All I know is their grades are dropping, so I'm going to pay for them to be part of this program. Turns out a lot of those students were using in ways that weren't super productive. And so they would share that with their mentor. The mentor would say, hey, why don't you go talk to Dylan a little bit, or go talk with those students. And we found, I think, almost 80% of our students in our first year through that relationship I built at lunch one day, learning about this really innovative program that I admired, and then they reciprocated that. So any other surprises that you've seen?
Yeah, I'm continuously surprised. The first one is the parking department. I had no clue how actively involved I was going to be with parking because we had to figure out for our on-campus 12-step meetings, they wanted to meet at different times, right, throughout the week. And so I had to get really close with parking because I needed passes so that people that weren't registered or enrolled in school could come and attend our meetings, because we wanted it to be available to the community too, to help with numbers. And so that was kind of a big thing. And they actually started to really like us. They kind of waived parking tickets and stuff. So, which is always a nice asset to be able to offer people. So there was that one. And then also we'd have an annual event that was a really big deal. And it took a couple of months to plan. And it was usually like 300 volunteers. And we just took any volunteers from across campus. It was called the Haunted Forest. And we would, for 7 nights around Halloween every year, we would put on like this scary trail on campus. And every year we would have people that were dressed up in zombies or clowns or creepy kids come up and say, you know what, I had no idea that you were, a recovery resource. I really need to talk to somebody. I mean, every year, just a totally new volunteer that liked to scare people would get involved and find out, meet our students that were infused throughout the trail, obviously, and hang out with them. And it was a really great accidental public awareness that we were able to offer to.
You remind me of a story. We were printing out our first set of flyers for the CRC that we were starting at the time. And the flyer just said, there were three of them. One said hope, one said like stigma, not in our house. They're just very simple, like they weren't super beat you over the head with the message, but they were simple enough to make you question what was going on. And then they had our link at the bottom of the flyer. When I picked up those flyers from the printing shop, the dude who handed them to me also handed me his 10-year coin.
Wow, that's so
So he
cool.
was like, "Oh, I'm glad you're doing this." And I was like, "Oh shoot!" Like I was like, "Oh, I did not expect this." I was like, I had my earphones on and everything, and I was like, "Well, dang! Like this is stuff that like you don't just being visible and kind of putting yourself out there through collaborations, even if it's through a service. Yeah,
Yeah,
you'll be surprised with who you find. Was that a happenstance type of thing? Of course it was, but all of this often can be
yeah,
breakthrough
absolutely.
with like, what just kind of happens to go right." So
And if we get really, really lucky, some of those situations turn into financial gifts too. I mean, there was a woman that owned a local salon who where I go get my hair done because there's not a lot of options for getting your hair done in Statesboro, Georgia. And we got to be buddies. And her husband was like one of the biggest business owners in the city. No idea. And, they happened to have family that were in recovery and they started giving us pretty good donations on an annual basis. And I mean, again, like getting my hair done, right? Like that was not an intentional asset at all that I found, but just kind of being aware and having that elevator speech too, what do you offer? What do you do? Being able to like comfortably deliver it with confidence and then win people over with, with just your passion and love for the project.
I often talk with friends about how the hardest part of my month is when the person doing my hair says, "Oh, what do you do for work?" Like when you first start a job, that can be one of like the most awkward moments because you want to be able to say the right things, but also have it be accessible, so they're not asking you 55 follow-up questions. But
Yeah.
like, yeah, you got to figure it out. And yeah, elevator speech is a really valuable asset that actually makes you money. And I had
Yeah.
a similar experience where I was buying the students LaCroix because we had to stack up the fridge we had in the center. And the students had described her to me before. She's like, "Oh, there's this woman at Target who goes to meetings with us and yada yada." And she asked me, "What do you do?" And I told her, and she's like, "Oh, my students or the people I go to meetings with, they've talked about you." And it was just like full circle moment of I'm just getting LaCroix at Target.
That's awesome.
Denver. Denver is massive, obviously,
Yeah.
and just like happened to be right person, right time. And so, but that was 9 months into doing the work. And so
Yeah.
yeah, you plant seeds everywhere you go. You have to have faith and be comfortable with the fact that you may have to say, we're still getting started for a year or maybe two before this thing starts sprouting left and right.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
it can be a lonely and kind of difficult time period.
It is. It is really challenging. I think reaching out to other colleagues and getting plugged into networks that like SAFE is trying to build and AREG too. It was really helpful for me to have. I think there was like 3 people that I would call and rely on.
Mhm.
And Sasha McLean, who is the executive director at Archway Academy, a recovery high school in Houston, she she's a dear friend and she used to coach me on my elevator speech because Sasha, it's her favorite thing to do is ask people for money. And she taught me, you basically tell people what to think when you tell them what you do. Right. And so now I start off with, when they ask me what I do, it's like, oh, I have the best job in the whole world. I get to work with young people and kids as they, get a second chance at life. And they're like, oh, cool. Tell me more, instead of like, well, I do this like behavioral health thing, so I just go straight in and tell them what to think about what I do.
Yep. Yeah, I've learned over time to explain my job like the person I'm talking to is 5 because I have taken 10 years now just learning all the jargon and the language that I
Yep.
feel important, but then like no one else was on that journey with me, like learning the same things I was doing to defend myself. Like you just gotta say it like this is what it is. Like, again, it's just doing this badass stuff that we all love to do. And so
Right.
yeah. Well, opening to questions if folks have questions in the chat. So you might have an awkward silence for a bit, but in that time, is there any last things that you wanted to make sure folks know, or lessons you learned that you wanted to share?
Just that it takes time. It's unfortunately, I feel like, we're really lucky right now, or not lucky. I think our time is coming due where we're finally starting to get some public funds from states. And if some of the new set aside money comes out, from the president's budget, if we can get that passed through Congress, I think just understanding that it takes time. But when we do have the opportunity, that we need to know exactly what we want to do. So being strategic, always understanding what your resources are locally and how you can be an opportunity to them. And then just being, just gentle with yourself, because it takes time. It's hard to start a new program. It's not something that most people get done in 2 or even 3 years. So thank you all for what you're doing.
Yeah. And we're all just getting started. So Kristin, thank you so much. As always, it's just a joy talking to you, and we'll keep talking, I'm sure. But I'm going to go over some summer series logistics stuff before we close. And then, as always, during these webinar sessions, the safe staff, Kristin, you can stay if you want to, but I know you have meetings. We'll stick around for about 30 minutes after in case folks want to chat about anything that's going on or ask any questions. But yeah, that'll happen after we end the recording. The next thing we're going to do logistically in the homework for this week is for you to develop a SMART goal. We're going to have just that first draft due next week. You're going to get this worksheet that's on the slide. You'll be getting this via email tomorrow or the day after. Yeah, SMART goal. If you're not familiar with SMART goals, I'm not going to butcher the letters right now, but the sheet you'll get has the acronym laid out for you. You have your general goal, and then 5 steps on how you're going to get there, who you're going to work with, or if it's just going to be you who's responsible for all of this. Hopefully you're collaborating. You can talk about the time frames, what resources you need or that you have, and then barriers you predict. Talk about measurement, talk about how you're going to know you met your goal. And again, for the working group next week, this is due as a draft. And so you're going to propose this to your working group next week in pretty short, like maybe a minute. And then we're going to give some feedback to each other. But at the end of this program, so at the end of these 6 weeks, that's when we're going to you're going to turn these into us, and then we're going to use these to help you all as the year goes on. And that's all the content for today. Reminders for next week, of course, reach out to your working group leader, reach out to me, and really any of us for help if there's anything you need right now. If you've been taking notes, take time to look back over those. Let us know if you have any thoughts or questions about that. You are able to, if you would like, schedule a one-on-one with your working group leader during these 6 weeks. You all should have gotten emails from your working group leader by now. And then again, if you haven't done the census yet and the reflection along with that, do that by next week, and then it will help you do your SMART goal in a way that is actually targeted and can help you be effective. Yeah, thank you for being here.